As you may suspect, a number of our subjects are chosen as the result of letters and problems that are brought to our attention. Nearly always a letter will represent not just the person who wrote it, but a general condition involving a great many persons in similar situations who do not write. Therefore, this morning we have a subject that has arisen as a result of a group of problems that have been brought to our attention over the last several months. Nearly every person who is in trouble today, that is, in personal difficulty, psychological problem, domestic problem, social problem, nearly every such person, when you sit down and work with them, shows a distinct lack of interior resources. These persons have been either so disillusioned that what they thought was an adequate supply of personal strength has been exhausted, or else they belong to an ever-increasing number whose backgrounds have contained no spiritual strength. When we see the difficulty that the older generation is in, but also observe the number of persons in that generation who have personal interior strength, we wonder what the future will be when we meet the present generation growing older, where these resources are extremely slender, if present at all. One of the most difficult things to do in this world is to live from 60 to 70 years and keep your optimism. Yet it can be done and is successfully done every day. Also, the moment we find a person who has reached fullness of maturity without losing interior strength of ideal, we begin to examine that person to discover, if possible, their secret of tranquility. Usually, it is not the result of an easy life. The person who has maintained a consciousness of values is neither the rich person nor the successful one. Of course, this does not mean that it would be impossible to maintain values with success, but it is certainly more difficult. Actually, the difference in the condition of the inner life of the individual and that of other persons around him depends largely upon his own evaluation of facts and truths and principles in life. We have a term, faith, to cover a kind of believing, a strong inner conviction about value. And it is noticeable that the faith factor is diminishing in our modern world. Faith is not the direct result of belonging or affirming. Faith has some foundation in the ability of the individual to rationalize his own experience. Faith is usually the sum or the total of our values, and it is different for each person, different for each level of society. Yet substantially, faith is the person coming to a conclusion within himself which enables him to meet the pressures of the time with positive conviction. Faith is not the result of intellectualism, but intellectualism may, in some cases, support it, and in other cases, undermine it. Faith is not the result of education, although education can advance faith. Faith is an attitude about many things, an attitude by which values become themselves obvious and enriched by the character of the person into whose life these values come. Perhaps the simplest approach to the problem of faith lies in a positive acceptance of things as they are. The individual who is forever seeking to change things is usually in trouble. The only thing in the world we can change with any degree of optimism is ourselves. But in most cases, the individual, finding himself in a dilemma, thrashes around, causing further confusion to himself and other persons, and ultimately becoming discouraged, disillusioned, disheartened. Faith is the most powerful instrument that we have for the protection of the interior values of the individual. Yet you cannot simply tell an individual to have faith. You may point out to him the desirability of it. But faith is not simply acceptance. It is more than this. Faith is not merely affirmation. It arises from a chemistry or an alchemy within the experience mechanism of the person. Religion and philosophy have been very powerful instruments in the strengthening of faith. Philosophy, because it seeks to establish a reasonable world, a reasonable universe. Religion, because it seeks to place the values upon principles and upon internal activities rather than upon environmental circumstances. The faith of the small child is not weaker because that child has no immediate experience of life. This faith is instinctive. It arises from certain daily contacts with life. It arises also from a tremendous eagerness to believe, an eagerness to affirm the positive side of things, because the child has not, generally speaking, passed through any great disillusionment by which the beauty of the world is destroyed for him. For our purposes in the study of world religions and world philosophies, the end of all learning is that we shall discover the instrument of faith in ourselves. The purpose of learning is to reveal to the individual the true state of things, the kind of a world in which he lives, the kind of a universe in which he lives. It is not the end of learning to obscure facts, but to reveal them. And the problem of faith often involves the inability of the person to face facts and survive them constructively. A blind faith, a faith built upon man's own interpretation of things, can be dangerous to him. But it can only be dangerous if he lacks the perspective to realize his own shortcomings. The person who has lost faith has usually set up the machinery himself, by which this incident has occurred in his life. Religiously, faith is the belief in the existence of a divine power, inevitably and eternally good, and the guiding principle or energy at the root of existence. To the religious person, the world is the work of God, fashioned by the divine mind, sustained by the divine will, infused with the divine spirit. Therefore, this world and all that it inhabit is actually part of deity. If man has a positive belief in God, he must likewise, therefore, have a positive attitude toward the world, which is the work of God. Now we know that religious philosophies will not always support this position, that there has been in religion for a long time a conflict between godliness and worldliness, and a belief that in some way the world is opposed to God. This, it seems to me, arises only from the fact that the world is populated with creatures lacking a full knowledge of God, therefore not always acting in conformity with the divine will. This situation is inevitable, therefore does not represent a principle of evil, but a deficiency of understanding or enlightenment, by which things can be more correctly viewed or interpreted. Actually, however, as we investigate into the philosophical side of life and into the religious side of life, we observe that the universe, even scientifically speaking, is far greater than our ability to understand. That its resources are, in terms of our experience, limitless. That its laws, in terms of our understanding, are eternal and good. We therefore live within a lawfulness. We live within a world guided by principles. But just as we live in a community which also has rules and regulations, and yet for various reasons we disregard these rules, or perhaps break them because we are ignorant of them. So in the universe, the creatures inhabiting it may or may not immediately understand or accept the rules governing universal procedure. Theoretically, at least, man is the best adapted of all creatures to the understanding of the world in which he lives. Man has been given faculties and powers by means of which he can investigate and examine and contemplate. He has been given opportunities in terms of interior equipment by which it is possible for him to intuitively experience the universe, to know it from within his own knowledge and understanding. And also it is given to him to have the abilities by which he can cooperate with or modify universal procedure, or at least adapt many phases of it to his own needs or purposes. Thus man, living in a lawful universe, has the privilege and the right to experience its lawfulness. He has the right to examine all phenomena and to discover from such examination the principles and laws underlying the various procedures of existence. It is affirmed philosophically and scientifically that man, so examining making proper and adequate use of his faculties, must come in the end to the recognition that he does live in a vast plan of law and order, that he lives within a situation of itself good, and that it is his own ineptitudes and his own perversions that destroy this goodness as it may apply to his own life. Man is therefore continually searching for adjustment, recognizing that through adjustment, through gradually coming to obey and understand, he can create a proper way of life, and he can overcome most of the causes of pain and sorrow in his own experience. Now, many individuals feel that this long and difficult rational approach, requiring great thoughtfulness and study and examination and investigation, simply constitutes too burdensome a way of life. The individual does not wish to accept the responsibility for dedicating his energies to the solution of his problems. He therefore creates groups to carry on this activity in his name. He creates systems which he believes will protect him without it being necessary for him to personally understand everything against which he is protected. Actually, however, thousands of years of this type of living have not resulted in solution to man's primary difficulty. He realizes that his predisposition to ignore the essential nature of life as it applies to him has resulted in ages of misery, and that this procedure goes on unchanging from generation to generation. We have inherited it today. We have inherited with it, however, the greatest instruments of research the world has ever known. How does it happen, then, that we continue to explore the various dimensions of life without bringing the results of our explorations directly to bear upon our own conduct? Has not this exploration of space produced any strong moral convictions or ethical certainties in the life of the person? Have we not in some way gained an insight which we can apply to our own problems every day? If we have not done this, then a large part of this so-called progress is useless to us. Unless it guides us to proper codes of action, progress cannot assure even our survival. The person reading the paper, studying superficially the discoveries of his time, awed and frightened by the rapidity of world changes, intellectual, scientific, political, such persons are today unable to apply knowledge to its most legitimate end, the solution to their own needs. In fact, if anything, their needs increase, and the few solutions they thought they had slip away from them under the pressure of emergency. Through all of the knowledge that we have gained, therefore, there has to be an ensouling or a vitalizing. The body of knowledge, like the body of a person, is an extraordinary machine, wonderfully constructed, dramatically, divinely inspired and enlivened or vitalized. Yet the body of knowledge, like the person, must receive into itself a kind of living soul. Unless knowledge is ensouled, it cannot actually succeed. For it is the soul within knowledge which bestows the purpose of knowledge. And a thing which exists without reason or purpose has very little adequate foundation. The dignity of purpose, the magnitude of purpose, the inevitable value of purpose, these things must be determined. The individual who works only for his wages is not a good workman. The individual who marries only for security is not a good member of a family. A person trying to advance only for ambition is not a permanent asset to his community. Everything must have purpose. And unless the purpose be worthy of the act, the action itself will react destructively upon the person involved or upon the situation in which the action is functioning or working. So purpose becomes the ensoulment of a thing, for it is soul that gives man insight. And insight becomes the basis of purposeful action. The individual whose life is dedicated to principles bigger than he is will have a good life. An individual who merely uses big principles to advance small ends will not have a good life. The individual who, seeking for value, unfolds interior apperceptions will have a growth of life in himself which can assist him to meet the problems of his time. By ensouling knowledge, we give it universal dedication to purpose. As we ensoul our own consciousness, we also give significance to the things that we do. Now, most persons would like to be more useful than they are. Yet between nearly all of us and the ends which we would like to accomplish stands the barrier of our own uselessness. The individual is simply not able to integrate his own resources sufficiently well to have the kind of useful life that he wants. His temperament, his personality, his attitudes block his usefulness. Or perhaps his simple ignorance makes it impossible for him to perform correctly the tasks with which he would like to be engaged. So everywhere, usefulness and expression of interior purpose depend upon certain achievements or attainments within man himself. These attainments have to do with the simplifying and directionalizing of his inner life. Nearly everyone with a problem lives in the midst of the confusion and distraction of personal lack of orientation and organization. We are moved so tremendously by the tempests of pressure within ourselves that we do not have the ability to approach any matter with the proper mental, emotional, spiritual resources. And lacking this ability, we do not achieve the ends which we might otherwise reasonably accomplish. East and West, we have the same general report, namely that the great achievements of individuals arise from a kind of dedication, that the person can never have small dedications and achieve great ends. That the dedication must be to principles that are themselves sufficiently important to merit the devotion of our life and time to the fulfillment of these principles. Eastern and Western philosophy agree that the beginning of the useful life is the life in which interior values have been clarified. And both East and West also agree that in some way the term which we call faith has to do with this clarification. Faith is an acceptance of truth, the only way in which we can ever achieve truth. We are constantly seeking to understand the full definition of abstracts and ultimates, but we are utterly confused. These abstracts are beyond us. We can, however, receive into our own lives continuously the evidence of the reality of things. And accepting this evidence, we can use it as the foundation of faith. Faith does not mean that we have to have the answers to everything. Faith simply means a simple and natural acceptance of the reality of answers. The reality of the simple truth that the laws governing creation are great enough to make certain that this creation fulfills its own destiny. We have tried to determine this destiny, and here have come into other difficulties. We have tried to tell the universe what to do, but we have overlooked the fact that we cannot tell ourselves what to do. And the great structures we build collapse simply because they were unlawful or were created without receptivity to truth, without the acceptance of principles as they might be given to us to be known, if we permitted them to be known in our own living. So in our search for faith and our effort to establish faith, we probably must sit down somewhere along the line and work out a series of basic principles or basic premises. And we have to decide by a decision of our own consciousness on which side of a broad problem we wish to take our stand. If we wish to assume with materialistic thinking that there is no moral nature in the world, that the universe is simply unfolding opportunity, and that it can be turned and moved and directed according to the will of rational creatures and regardless of its own purposes, that the world technically has no purpose except what we make of it. If we wish to take this kind of attitude, then our faith must rest completely in ourselves. If we believe that man is stronger than nature, and by virtue of his own organized intelligence can control nature, then the individual assumes the full responsibility of his action. He must determine what is right. He must determine what can be done. And he must also govern this world over which he has elected himself as governor with a wisdom and an integrity rather difficult for him to acquire. If he wishes to assume that life is a procession of emergencies, if he wishes to believe that a kind of fortuity governs things, that he will succeed if he has the breaks and fail if he hasn't. If he wants to live this way, then he must develop tremendous resources, or else gradually break to pieces under the pressure of a responsibility for which he is not fitted and for which he was never intended. Probably one of the reasons why a lot of so-called progressive moderns come to emotional and nervous crack-ups is because they are trying to carry too heavy a part of a responsibility that was never theirs. They have found it convenient to become molders of universal destiny when actually they have never solved their own problem. If we wish to assume that man can successfully change the course of nature, that he can permanently cause the rise and fall of worlds, that he has this tremendous supremacy over nature, then of course the struggle becomes an eternal problem in dictatorship. Man must produce one despot after another, and what he wills to do shall be the measure of his success. Many have tried this and come to dismal failure. They discover that in the problems of living, the individual whose only guiding star is success finds this star fade very quickly. He finds that he cannot live by such problem because he cannot assure the success. And as the success fades, the entire significance of his own life fades with it. He cannot really live this way. So from the beginning of our history, human beings who have tried to be bigger than life, who have tried to do it their way, or who have made happiness, pleasure, gratification their great rules of conduct, have come to critical periods in which the fallacy of their own position has been brought home to them. In this way, there is the old truism that the worst sinner makes the greatest saint. And most of the persons whom we regard highly today for their moral and ethical and spiritual virtues were persons disillusioned with false living, who finally turned from some form of personal excess, dissipation, and sought the consolation of something more substantial. In each case, the individual fought out with life the problem of his own purpose, and finally deciding that his own way of life was not producing the proper results, rededicated himself to the divine way. Today, in a sense, we see this also, because there is a tremendous rush of peoples to religion, an effort to find again the consolation of spirit needed for the living of a good life. Unfortunately, however, religion is no longer in a position to direct as it once directed. Religion in the course of time has gradually fallen upon evil situations itself. In the Western world, religion gradually came under the influence of private families and finally the public. Today, most of our religions live or die according to public approval or disapproval. The minister in the church is continually harassed by his own members. He must either do what they want or they will remove him. They will find someone who will do it their way. He has no liberty or freedom to go against them. He has no security because these parishioners provide him with his church. His first allegiance has to be to them. This places religion in general at a terrible disadvantage. It means that religion, to survive in a heavily economic situation, must pay its own bills the same as anyone else. And for the few privileges it may enjoy, it must carry a tremendous load of responsibilities. Religion, therefore, as far as institutional worship is concerned, is not a free agent. It is not capable of the full and complete statement of its own convictions. If it attempts this, it very likely will lose its existence from lack of support from its own parishioners. This means that the individual going to religious organizations for consolation goes to a situation that has been confused for 300 years with this problem of adaptation and compromise. This does not mean that religion will do no good, but it does mean that religion cannot and does not clearly state what the person must do in order to find his faith. It does not remind him of the heavy responsibility upon himself, because if it reminds him of this, he will not come back. Yet without this reminder, nothing is accomplished. The individual who believes he is saved by joining, joins enthusiastically. He gains a certain emotional support. It is quite possible that his life will be improved. But he mistakes in the end the purpose of religion. He mistakes the means by which religious security can be brought to him. And no one really seems to dare to point this up in the great body of our theological system. We talk about it, but we do not really require it, demand it, or make it an essential part of membership. Faith arising from religion must come from the person accepting the total responsibility of his belief. His belief must be strong enough and deep enough to support his own life under pressure. He must reach the point in which he has gained a new interior relationship with living. Now, of course, we have made this sound so difficult, so oppressively confusing, that it has appeared to many persons that the life of God and the life of nature are two distinct and different things, and that we must depart from one and cling to the other. Actually, nature itself is the life of God in motion, in action, and in various streams of symbolic processes. Nature and God are not opposites. One is merely the revelation of the other. And it is the same in the life of the person. The spiritual life is not at variance with the natural life. It is rather that the natural life, having for a long time continued without leadership, without any directive, presents the same situation to us as a neglected child. If a family has a child, and through the early years of that child's life, the family is indifferent, allowing this child to more or less drift along with babysitters and nurses and kindergartens and boarding schools. Then suddenly, when the child is in its middle teens, the family, recognizing responsibility, tries to take over. They then find that the child has no particular interest in them, that the child has certain appreciations perhaps, but no intimate experience of the reality of parents. The child by this time is probably not easily changed, nor easily convinced that parents that have neglected it through the most necessary years have suddenly developed a sincere desire to become better parents. The child which has been allowed to drift has drifted away from confidence, has drifted away from community interest, and from spiritual association with the parents. And these subtle values are not easily restored. In our personal living, the same thing has happened. Our objective life has gradually drifted away from our spiritual purpose. It has done so because the objective life has been continuously cultivated and the spiritual purpose has been consistently ignored. Now, after a comparatively long period of time, we wish to bring this ungoverned material existence back into line with spiritual purpose. We discover very little of sympathy now between these two parts of ourselves. It is easy to assume that the body is the enemy of the spirit. It is not, any more than the neglected child is the enemy of its parents. It simply does not know them. It has very little inclination to be suddenly dominated by persons that have consistently neglected it. It sees no reason why it should obey, having never been previously required to obey. So the child may become rebellious, and if the pressure is continued, may come into open antagonisms. But the antagonisms arise not within the basic nature of the child, but arise from the basic pattern of neglect by which basic values were injured. The relation between the person and his environmental life is exactly the same in this respect. The outer life that we live is not different from the inner life, except by direction and emphasis. And the person who suddenly wishes to take over the management of himself suddenly also discovers that he is attempting to manage an incorrigible. He is trying to affirm a code over a life that has been codeless, that has gone its own way and done as it pleased. It is trying to bind into some kind of teamwork a personality that has run its own affairs without interference or disturbance from anyone for too long. Not only in itself, but in tradition. For the person is also fighting thousands of years of history in which individuals have done as their personalities pleased. and have given little, if any, consideration to the principles behind them. If we try to head into this situation, we may very likely get into the same condition the parent does, trying to reaffirm authority over the neglected child. I've had several parents come to me that were in breakdowns because of this, emotionally and mentally disturbed, not only by their inability to control the young person, but also as the result of the dawning conscience in which they had begun to realize that the whole problem rested upon their own earlier neglect. They could hardly blame the child at all because they began to see the symptoms of the way they themselves had changed the natural disposition of the child and alienated it. So all kinds of headaches arise. But of course the great headache in life comes when the person tries to organize himself, tries to affirm some value stronger than the daily pressure. Actually, we are motivated by a machinery of motion in which each day bestows a mainspring upon the next day. Thus we live today to exhaust the things we started yesterday, or to advance them. And lying down at night with a mass of unfinished projects, we have already mortgaged tomorrow. Therefore, we are continually following out these projects without any essential plan behind them. We are grateful if we can get through the day without one of these projects falling to pieces on our hands. Thus we have regret for the mistakes of the past and anxiety about the state of these projects in the future, with no greater meaning for life than that tomorrow shall be the continuance of today, or that tomorrow we shall achieve what was forbidden of today. With this sort of being pushed along by a clock, pushed along by our own unfinished business, pushed along largely by exterior pressures, seldom if ever self-moved. As we go along like this, we gradually exhaust our time allotments and fall into the grave as the last push of some yesterday. This situation, when we begin to think about it, does disturb a little. For it shows that throughout life, very few persons use any of their essential humanity. They do not recognize or use the power which is the supreme power in themselves, the power of self over circumstance. They have never exercised it, or if they have, find the responsibility too odious and immediately forget about the whole thing. Yet it is only by the ensouling of a life that it becomes significant. And the moment that this ensouling takes place, the body and the outer life move into conformity with value and pattern. There is no conflict. There is no terrible disaster. There is no great sacrifice. We suddenly use this situation as it should be used, namely that the outer life of man is for the expression of his inner life, not for its repression. And only when we begin to move from within through body into environment will we make the changes the world is hoping for. Only when we live from within ourselves is there any hope for world peace, or any hope for securities, or the restorations of the dignities of integrity and honesty. These things must move from the level of man's internal psychic life and not be merely codes on the outside. As long as they are codes, men resent them. But when they move from within man, he sustains them, because they are himself, and not something another person has demanded of him. Faith, then, has to do with this reorientation process. First of all, it means that the individual believes that the interior part of himself can become the guide of his life. He believes this because he comes to identify this internal part of himself with deity. He believes firmly that the Father in him doeth the works, that there is a power within himself by which he is predestined and foreordained to achieve victory, that the use of this power to its own natural and proper end assures him of the ultimate victory of internal value over external conditions. Faith, therefore, begins with the acceptance of a certain interior experience of strength. Nor is this faith completely blind. Looking around him, man observes that others have done this, that there is an available. He observes that certain persons have made magnificent adjustments between interior value and life around them. Therefore, it can be done. Man also realizes that he possesses a consciousness, that situations around him have not this same consciousness. The program of life which he is following has no consciousness of itself. It has only the consciousness he imposes upon it. Therefore, to permit life as pattern to dominate life as consciousness is obviously wrong. It is not necessary that the individual shall do things because he has always done them. It is only necessary for him to do them if they are essentially right. And the problem of dividing between rightness and habit is a problem that requires some discrimination. But this discrimination man possesses if he wishes to use it. It is obvious also that many persons cannot argue this situation through to any kind of a logical termination. Man is not able to approach the inner mysteries of his life with this grandiose certainty with which he votes for the wrong ticket. He cannot do these things. He must therefore realize that this self, this divine nature in him, is not to be dictated to, not to be demanded of, that it is to be accepted in the simplest and most direct manner possible. Faith, therefore, as a way of life, slowly simplifies the relationship between the personality and the being behind it. He takes the simple ground that this being, like universal law itself, is forever operating, that it is continuously present in its own nature, that it cannot be essentially and substantially compromised, nor will it ever change its own ways to please the purposes of man. Therefore, the discovery of the nature of this eternally unchanging principle is man's first responsibility. And he discovers this nature very largely by relaxing to it, by permitting it to exercise its own ways in his life. If the person, with all of his unsettled business, tries to relax, he will go negative. He will do nothing, which is not the end intended. he will have nothing to do if he breaks the habits of the things he has done. Consequently, merely to stop doing things is not the answer. It is an answer, however, to establish a stronger and more intimate communion with interior value. And the individual who is able to restore something of the power of consciousness over action within himself will gain according to his achievement. Unfortunately, however, we usually approach this with the highest and most profound biases. In other words, looking for the life within us, we demand something. We demand that this life be what we expect it to be. We demand that it be a knight in armor that will win victories for us. We demand that it shall be the source of peace, power, and plenty. We demand that it shall give us victory over our enemies. We demand that it look like this or look like that. We demand that it be in the terms of our own sect or our own creed. And most of all, we demand that it will be exactly what we have always thought it was going to be. By the time we get through placing our own boundaries upon this, we are likely to arrive in the end only at hallucination and not at illumination. If we force this thing within us to fulfill only our expectancy, we are doomed to continuous disappointment, for we will have discovered only another subconscious function of our own minds. We will be no nearer to the truth than we were before. The actual situation means that there has to be an openness to the nature of this interior power or force. There has to be an ability to worship without defining, of experiencing without naming, of accepting without interpreting out of everything that which it really contains. Therefore, mysticism has pointed out that the search for inner faith is incompatible with ulterior motive of any kind. That it is ulterior motive that has caused the trouble from the beginning. It is the individual seeking something for a reason less than the value of the thing itself. Man does not seek truth because he is miserable, because he is poor, because he is sick, because he is sad. He does not seek truth because error has failed. He does not seek truth because he is lonesome. He does not seek truth because he wants something to do or to build a career. These things may result, but if they are the reason for the search will fail. Man seeks truth only for one thing, namely, that it is the normal, proper, and inevitable thing that he should do, and that only by so doing has he a right to consider himself a human being. The moment we use these various means to plug up our own weaknesses, we lose the power to perceive the truth. The moment we allow an ulterior purpose to cause us to regard truth-seeking as an escape from error, or an escape from the consequences of our own conduct, the moment we take such an attitude, we have begun subtly to discolor and deform truth, and to block ourselves from the recognition of its proper ends and purposes. This is the reason why we say again and again that so much of this field is nothing but psychic self-deceit. It is self-deceit while the self-factor makes the deceiving possible. This is another reason why we face the situation that if a person is still, is quiet, is relaxed, seeks to be receptive to truth, that if this receptivity is conditioned by ulterior motives of any kind, then this quietude becomes negation, not quietude, and the individual receives a stream of his own complexes instead of the truth he seeks. The individual who is self-deceived in his motives, therefore, will be self-deceived when he attempts any form of mystical spiritual extension. Nature, therefore, demands that the truth seeker shall seek reality or shall worship God honestly. Honestly in the sense that he seeks to know and to obey. That he is not trying to use deity, but is seeking to become an instrument for the expression of the life that is within him. If his motive is right, quietude will result in a release of divine energy in him. If his motive is wrong, quietude will release only his own delusions, his own complexes, and intensify his own difficulties. Faith, therefore, is important because it cuts through self-interest. It is true that at the beginning of his search, the desperate person in trouble is primarily seeking only solution to that trouble. Actually, however, all trouble is symbolic. It represents the individual who has cut off his supply of universal good as far as his conscious ability to use it is concerned. It is true that the individual is brought to this realization through trouble, or perhaps through observing general common conditions in which trouble is an equation. But this observation should also carry with it a certain estimation of the facts that his own trouble and all trouble arises from the person imposing his own will upon infinite processes, and that until he reverses this procedure, allowing life to move through him, he will continue in trouble. I have observed several books recently, written in the scientific temper, bewailing this mystical concept, affirming that if the individual ceases to be aggressive and settles down to permitting the universe to move through him, that civilization as we know it may fall to pieces. If we continue as we are, we have every reason to assume that civilization will fall to pieces. We are evidently now in a situation in which continuing to do things as we have done them, and by the same motives that we have always been able to conjure to sustain these actions. If we continue this way, we are coming into the most tragic situation. If sincerity, honesty, integrity, and internal spiritual identity, if these things will destroy a civilization, then the civilization is wrong. Anything that can be destroyed by truth will be destroyed by truth. And anyone who tries to keep it going is merely bucking the inevitable. It is that which is advanced by truth, because in turn it has advanced truth. That is the thing or the situation or the culture that will survive. So in our personal life, we have these decisions to make. And in making them, we call upon such resources as we have available. We sit down quietly to analyze the problem of restoring our own believing, going back into time in which we did believe. Let us imagine that we can go back to those childhood years when the world looked like infinite opportunity, when the individual felt his own strength and the weakness of circumstances and set forth to accomplish wonders. Then observe the changes that time has wrought. How by degrees these optimisms sag, these incentives vanish, until the person, captured in a web of circumstances, resigns himself to the inevitable pressures of his time. Is the world actually any different? Is the child of 14 looking out upon life, seeing a different world from the man of 60? Actually, he is not seeing a different world, but he has a different personal relationship with it. The young person has not been disillusioned. The young person has faith in his own strength. So life sets to work to gradually undermine that faith. And I think our entire system of culture, because it is seeking to establish conformity, is responsible largely for this destruction of individual faith. The world is afraid of the individual. The world is afraid of the nonconformist. It realizes, according to its own thinking, that the unadjusted person will be miserable. And the individual who believes beautiful things that are not so, according to the world, is only heading to disaster. Therefore, let's get rid of the beliefs before they ruin him. As a cure, he is given a series of unbeliefs, a series of negative statements affirmed to be true. He is told the world is not as good as he thought it was. He is told that the things he can do are not as numerous or as important as he believed them to be. And little by little, he is undermined and brought into conformity with the world, it being assumed that this is the most comfortable way to be. Probably everyone working on it is very altruistic. They do not want this person to go out and suffer throughout life from broken dreams. So they'll take the dreams away from him in the beginning, so that he can go out and spend his life without any dreams, but perchance with a number of nightmares, which have been substituted as a reasonable remedy. To prevent this kind of thing, the young person is too young to have the authority to change anything. The older person has already broken back into the disillusionment. And it is only as life comes near to its end that infinite wisdom, bringing with it a certain release from the disillusions of worldliness, will enable the older person to live again part of the beauty that was taken away for so many years. Thus, in many instances, the older person comes back to the gentle, simple beauties of childhood and lives a rather peaceful, natural, and satisfying period near the end of life. Actually, there was no need for all this brutal, terrible, disillusioning procedure. It is only due to man's concept that the visible things he sees are the values that he must defend. Whereas actually all of these visible things are only the results of his own attitudes, not the causes of them. It is quite possible for the person to retain most of the dream of childhood throughout life without being weak, without being gullible, and without being foolish. It all depends upon getting some term in internal integration, to get a value that is stronger than the appearances with which we are forever being plagued. Let us assume then certain truths and try to prove them. And you can prove them if you want to. If you want to go out in life and look around you. You can say to yourself, life is not as happy as I thought it was. Some people are not as happy as they should be. Many people who have much to be grateful for are not grateful. And others with very little are constantly grateful. Therefore, as I look around me, there are those who apparently are encouraging and others who are discouraging. But these things do not constitute disillusionments. These things are facts. Facts do not destroy dreams, because if we examine any fact thoroughly enough, the dream is restored. It is when we do not examine, but merely accept or reject, that our dream is damaged. If we go near enough to these people whom we have learned to suspect, we shall discover so much of beauty, so much of dignity, and so much of sincerity that our respect will be restored. The reason we do not keep these values is because we walk by hastily. We read the newspaper, which tells us of the 1% that is always in trouble. And we forget the 99% that is trying to live a decent, useful, constructive life. We go into these different homes where reputation says there is much trouble. There is trouble. But this trouble is also in the presence of strange, perhaps mistaken sincerities. These people in trouble are not bad people. They are mistaken people. They are people often who are making a tremendous sacrifice for the wrong thing. They are not always selfish people. Perhaps their very unselfishness is the cause of the misery in which they find themselves, because their understanding is not great enough. But when you get through thoroughly studying these things, you do not find a world of monsters. You find a world of hurt, confused people, most of whom would really like to be better than they are. Most of whom in an emergency will come forward and serve you unselfishly. But they have not the genius to organize their own resources. So when we look out into a world of hatefulness, we are really looking out into a world of hurt, of people who have been variously conditioned against value, whose own lives have given them these distortions and deformities and biases with which we now associate them. But underneath all of these different values, there is the tremendous wealth of essential humanity, which is not corrupted, but simply does not have an opportunity to express itself. Any situation thoroughly examined will bring back our respect. It is the partial examination that destroys it. Any situation thoroughly understood will cause us at the end to say, perhaps I could not have judged it any better than those who did. It is easy to stand on one side and be sure of everything. Becoming involved in a thing and watching it day by day, we gain an increasing insight into the basic desire of the average person to be a reasonable individual. We find the proof of this value coming up just as seeds rise from the earth in the desert. We see life everywhere. And the more we study life, the more sympathetic we become. It is the person with no reflective or thoughtful faculties who is so certain about the evilness of everything. By degrees, then, thoughtfulness and the right attitude will not manufacture good, because you cannot. But it will not manufacture evil, for this you can do. Good does not need to be manufactured, it is. Evil has to be the result of artificial factors, because in substance it is not. It has no nature or being of itself. Thus the struggle between good and bad is always unequal. Good has to win, because good is a principle that is growing and living in nature. Evil is not. If then we are attempting to understand and will relax a little, faith will show us that it is possible. It is within common sense and reason that we can live good lives. We can help other people. And that the real trouble in most of problems is ulterior motive. The reason the thing doesn't solve itself properly is because the person isn't honest. So honesty becomes part of religion. And honesty is the very essence of religion. And in honesty we have the proper supporting principle for faith. And in the end, faith, with honesty, and with the simple ability to perceive or apperceive the internals of things, to feel with them rather than to rationalize them. This experience will show us how the infinite will and the infinite love and the infinite wisdom are working through this confused pattern, not to afflict and torment things, but to bring them into maturity together. That all these troubles that we see are merely the only way that nature has of helping us to help ourselves. The purpose of man's conscious existence appears to be out of nature, that he shall become a creature of self-decision, that he shall do right because he chooses to do right, and that his faculties have to be initiated and matured by personal right decision. This personal individuation that must come to man cannot be bestowed by the gods. It is conceivable and obvious that had the universe wished all things to be inevitably at peace, it could have been so ordained. There is not a problem that we have that could not have been left out of the fabric of the world had the Creator of the world wanted to leave it out. If these problems were not in some way related to the necessities of existence, they would not exist. Nature maintains nothing that is unnecessary and invents nothing that is useless. Obviously, the philosophy of the matter is that for man, virtue must be self-decision. It cannot be decided for him. For some reason, the elaborate psychic nature which he possesses demands this, Therefore, laws cannot be so strict, or truths so obvious, that the individual cannot resist them. He must choose. He must make a decision of himself, out of himself, and align himself consciously with the creative principles of life. In order that this should happen, he must be presented continuously with the need, but never must he be over-influenced. He must be allowed to continue his own way until he outgrows it himself. Some people wonder why it was so ordained. We do not know why it was so ordained, but we can suspect that it is not different from the problem of the over-sheltered child. The child who never makes decisions of its own becomes a weak and worthless person. And in nature it is quite possible that man's high destiny in eternity demands this high testing here and now. In any event, the test is here. And all these problems through which we are passing are not mere disasters heaped on us. We have to cause them, and we have to cure them. The problem rests strictly with man. But the machinery of cause and cure was established in nature in the beginning, so that no creature would be without this way of attainment, this way of salvation through works, through the accomplishment of that which is immediately necessary and must be done. Actually, therefore, a problemed world need not cause us to doubt the wisdom of God. A problemed world does not need to cause us to lose faith, because actually a problem world exists only for solution. And it is no more right that this problem should be regarded as a menace and an adversary than that a school examination should be regarded as a disaster. The person is required to prove certain values in himself and to develop his life along the lines of these values. Nature is determined that when man is finally converted, this conversion will be absolute and complete. And in order to achieve this, every false situation must be exhausted. A man must come finally to truth, because there is no substitute, no way in which he can depart from truth and still enjoy the securities and advantages of life. Today, at our present stage of growth, we may not even know the full meaning of truth. We do not know its ultimate implications. But we do have the possibility of perceiving that the thing as it is a legitimate part of a plan. Therefore, that in the presence of it we can have faith. We do not need to be disillusioned. The only cause of real disillusionment would be that evil should ultimately succeed. Then we might say there is no law. But as long as mistakes produce their penalties, we know the law exists. As long as the individual who is not good is not happy, the world is honest. But the moment the person who is not good is truly happy, then we may question nature. But the moment we see this situation and attempt to question nature, in that moment we perceive that the so-called happy person is not happy. And we discover that nature in its own way has found means to reach into the life of every individual who is wrong and present that person with problems appropriate to his mistake. Not because it wishes to sadistically hurt anybody, but because wrong cannot win. As we develop certain values of this kind, when we know that through experience and observation and study and interior contemplation, that we have obvious and evident proof that wrong cannot win, that right cannot lose, and that with all these different values and principles, we have unchanging realities. As this comes through to us, through thinking about it and looking for it, we begin to see how substantial a faith can be. We gradually recognize that we have an ever-present help in time of trouble, that deity is in its heavens, and that things are right with the world. The problem is that man must become himself right with his conscience and with his consciousness. The thing that is out of step is man. This is not too dangerous, but it is most uncomfortable. And to get back into the pattern is to move with truth to the accomplishments of its own purposes. In due time, if we move with it, we shall know it. At this time, we must have faith in its reality. But this faith need not be blind. It can be supported instantly by any individual who wishes to support it. A thorough and proper examination of any circumstance will reveal the law. But if we pass by condoning or condemning without a second thought, we shall never find the law in anything. But when we examine things, we will probably come out much as Will Rogers came out when he said in his rather interesting, bizarre life, he never met a man he didn't like. We all know people that we don't like, but the problem is we don't really know them. By degrees, a sharing would reveal much. But in our haste and in our determination to build these patterns of acceptance and rejection, we fail to go deep enough. So on the surface of things, we can have innumerable doubts. But the deeper we dig, the greater our faith. Because depth always justifies faith, as shallowness denies faith. So we dig a little deeper, and we find value. And as we go further, we find why other persons have not done better than they have. But all the time, we should be mindful that we have not done as well as was possible for us. And in our weaknesses, we have a comradeship of seeking. A seeking for better ways and better things. But out of all of our sincerity must come the supporting power of conviction. And conviction is faith. And conviction relates to certainties. And by the name of deity, we now recognize our code of ultimate certainties. Therefore, the will of the Creator becomes the law of the creation. And we affirm that this will and this law are righteous. That therefore this creation is righteous. That the things that happen because, according to the divine understanding, these must all work together for good. And that the very sorrow which we pass through is clearly justified in our own thoughtfulness. For by this sorrow we are led to seek for truth and for faith and for God. Thus the mistakes we make turn us back upon the path of truth. And our doubts finally bring us to that situation in which faith becomes necessary. Our simpler answer, of course, is the positive cultivation of these virtues, so that by decision we choose the beautiful and the true and the good, without waiting for disaster to force this choice upon us. But what we call disaster is nothing but law operating. The law which has as its end not a disaster, but our happiness, our security, and our re-identification with the divine being at the root of life. Therefore, all our doubts and fears move us along the road that leads to truth and God and righteousness. And when we begin to know that and feel it, our faith is stronger. We face the day realizing that its lesson is important. We stop shaking our fists at the heavens and settle down to the simple work of using the lessons of problems to prove the presence of God and law in all things. Time's up. Now, I think next Sunday would be a good continuation of this, the search for the purposeful life. And we had a problem with this not long ago, where it just seemed as though the individual couldn't find anything worth doing. So next Sunday morning, we're going to search for a purposeful kind of life. A life on various levels that will give us all something a little more to do. And I think that will help in most cases. The new issue of our journal is on the table this morning. It has a number of articles which we hope you will find interesting and helpful, including the last section of our series on Paracelsus and his philosophy. We hope that you will all secure a copy of the journal if you are not subscribers, and if you are subscribers, don't forget to keep your subscription active. We plan a very special winter number this year, and we know you will all want to be subscribers for that one. Our little booklet, The Quiet Way, will be of help in connection with the talk of this morning. We recommend it for you. The second volume of our collected writings is now in process of free subscription. We are putting out this series of books in this way because it is the only way in which we can get them to you under the present economic stress of our times. We are pre-subscribing the book, which will be delivered about 30 days after the time of pre-subscription. The work is already practically on the press. In other words, the type has all been set, the corrections have been made, and it will probably go on the press the 1st of June. So it will be out on time if your pre-subscriptions make it possible. So we're inviting those of you who wish to secure the work to help us in this way. As a compensation for the pre-subscription, you receive a specially attractive binding without extra charge. So we hope that you will cooperate with us in this respect. Don't forget our classes at headquarters, and come around once in a while and see how the building is progressing. We think you will enjoy it and see that our new home is really taking shape. And we certainly look forward to seeing you with us again next week. Thank you very much.